We will begin our Larger Acreage Habitat Panel now. So I'd like to welcome Jonathan Baxter with Partners for Fish and Wildlife, Michelle Furr with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Ryan Diener with Quail Forever, and Bubba Groves, also with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. If you all would like to briefly introduce yourselves, we can get started. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yep, thank you. I'm Jonathan Baxter. I'm the state coordinator for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm out of Conway, Arkansas, and I apologize. My video is misfunctioning at the moment. I'm trying to work through it, but I'll try to get it up before this is over with, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, I'm Michelle Furr. I am up here out of the Fort Smith office with the Arkansas Game and Fish, and I am the Private Lands Biologist over here.
I'm Ryan Diener. I'm the state coordinator for Quail Forever here in Arkansas. I work in a partnership position with Quail Forever and NRCS, so I've done quite a few habitat projects here in Arkansas, Missouri, as well as Kansas.
Bubba, can you take control and unmute your mic, or do you need me to fix anything? It looks like there's some technical difficulties, so while I take care of that, I'm going to ask the question to the panelists, something that we got asked this last go around. I'm not sure if you were on. Can restored prairie vegetation get to a climax state and not require further maintenance, or just minor maintenance? And the area that he was thinking about is approximately an acre.
Sure. So I heard the answers that were given for the previous one, and they're all very, very good. I very much agree with what was said. So when we're dealing with something, especially if you're actually trying to do a prairie restoration, not just a kind of a basic native seeding with a few species, but an actual prairie restoration, whether you're talking about something that's a quarter acre or 100 acres, there's really no end climax state where it just becomes stable and doesn't shift or need management of some degree or form. So here, like Lori pointed out, we live on the edge of the prairie biome. You're going to have trees come in. Climate and amount of carbon in the atmosphere and everything's a lot different than it was, several decades ago. So woody brush is going to be a problem. It's going to try to invade that site from anywhere and everywhere. Trees will help that, or birds will help plant new woody stuff for you. Tree species that are early colonizers have light, fluffy seed that blows in will help colonize that site. So no matter what, there will always be some type of management or maintenance that's needed to keep that in a good state and to be considered a high quality restored prairie site. Even just the prairie itself doesn't exist without doesn't exist on its own without some type of management over the long term. So you still need something, and by far the most preferred way and the most natural way is going to be prescribed fire, and chances are we're not going to have things like grazers on that site, but prescribed fire is very natural, very needed and necessary form of management to maintain those sites. I
agree with what Ryan said. We always going to have to do some sort of maintenance. I mean, that's an ecological function of those ecosystems, and we can't take that out and still have the functionality that we want, regardless of the size of the acreage.
Michelle, did you have anything to add?
No, I agree. All the above.
Thank you. So when establishing a pollinator plot, do we have to plow the ground up for site prep?
No.
Did you say plow?
Yes, I said plow.
Okay, no.
Negative.
Preferably, we'd like to burn it and not have a ground disturbance. If you plow the ground up, you might find stuff you didn't know was there, like a whole field of ragweed. instead of what you planted.
I'm assuming that the justification for that is to try to get seed to soil contact when you go to do your planting, and there's other ways to do that. Fire being preferred to help reduce the chaff that's left on the ground from your burn downs, but I would prefer not to plow. You're just releasing seeds that have been dormant in that seed bank for a long time, and you're just going to go back to square one and have to start over again, typically.
Yep. So I agree. We generally tell people that that's our last choice option if we can't get site prep done well any other way. So really, fire's great, especially after a couple spraying applications, but if you've sprayed it a couple times throughout a growing season with maybe, a mowing or two in between to keep stuff low, a lot of that vegetation is going to melt down pretty good, and you're going to have good seed soil contact. You might not even have enough material to do a prescribed burn prior to seeding, which is fine. That means you have enough bare ground to not need that, and it won't be necessary. As Jonathan and Michelle mentioned, you're going to stir up that seed bank, and you're going to get a huge flush of annual weedy species, hopefully most of them native annual weedies, so we don't worry about them too much as far as competition in the long term, but it's still unnecessary competition that we've encouraged because of that soil disturbance. And worst case scenario, you stir up things like Johnson grass, more Bermuda, other non-native, potentially invasive species that are in that soil profile that may not have been as big of an issue otherwise. The other part of that too is you're going to potentially have more erosion off of that site anytime you disturb the soil and have that sitting bare like that for a while. And you're also going to do damage to the soil microbes. So anytime you plow or disc or disturb the soil like that to that degree, you're going to really set back your soil mycorrhiza fungi too. So as we heard earlier, that's a negative thing, and we want to try to keep those soil microbe communities in place because they're going to help us out in the long run. But we definitely disturb those with soil disturbance to that degree, and we end up generally, according to research, helping move that soil microbe community from largely fungal based and mycorrhizae based towards a microbe community of bacteria, which is very similar switch we see going from grassland to cropland. So even just one application can make pretty drastic moves in that direction and be detrimental in the long term.
Awesome. Did anyone else have anything to add? I have our next question. Okay, so I think it's going back to the plowing question. So what if you have a large stand of Sericea on the site? And I'm assuming that he means Sericea lespedeza.
I'll go ahead and jump in and go first. So with Sericea, that's one that's definitely on that list of species that you're going to encourage more growth if you do plowing or disking. So I've heard and I've read some things about people trying to do like deep plowing with the goal being to turn that soil over and bury the Sericea seed that might be closer to the surface to keep it from coming up. I've seen that done a few times with very mixed or poor results. And no matter what, you're still going to have plenty of Sericea there, and you're left with spraying. That's really the only realistic way to really take care of that well. Ideally, it's not thick enough to where you can go out and spot spray it. Then it's not as big of a problem, and we can still move forward with the seeding and just worry about spot spraying Sericea as it comes back. But if you have an area that's pretty heavily dominated by Sericea, I highly recommend working on Sericea control for a period of a few years prior to coming in and seeding any type of native forbs. You can certainly go in and seed grass because the control methods we'll use for the Sericea won't impact your native grasses. But ideally you can start, every year starting in May through July, get a good spraying on that Sericea with a good broadleaf herbicide, pasture guard has proven to be the most effective with pretty good efficacy. Beyond that, you can use some other chemicals too, and they're slipping my mind at the moment. But May through June is the best time to treat that before it gets too tall and woody. If you can't hit it in that time frame, if you hit it later in the summer once it flowers, we have to move on to a more expensive chemical that can work, but it's going to be more expensive to treat that same site. And then with making sure you get that sprayed annually, and as you can, either in the fall or through the winter, getting prescribed burns on that site as often as you can to stimulate that seed bank, to get them to germinate, to continue to spray those new seedlings out. That will help you wear through that seed bank quicker. And I've seen fields that were basically solid Sericea that had been there for 20 years, pretty well knocked back and controlled within 3 to 4 years, to where you go from a solid stand of Sericea over multiple acres to just spot spraying sites. So it can be labor intensive, and I don't want to talk people out of doing Sericea control on large areas, because I think it's very, very important and it's well worthwhile. Just know that you're going to be providing a different type of habitat for a while you're doing that control before you can move on to a more diverse plant.
Yeah, I agree with what Ron said, and I'm just going to go ahead and clear the air. It was brought up on the smaller acreage forum just previous, but herbicide used correctly is a very good tool. It's a tool that we essentially have to use in order to reach our end goal. And I know there's a lot of mixed feelings about it, but it is what it is. And like Ryan said, use the correct herbicide, use the correct instructions on the label and the correct amounts and application techniques. It can be a useful tool.
Awesome, thank you. So let's see, do pollinator plots help with my honeybees in my bee boxes?
I'll go ahead and take that one. So I'm also a beekeeper, and the answer to that is yes. Some of my best bee yards are near areas that have had pollinator restoration done, or some sort of monarch project or pollinator or prairie habitat done. And the benefit of that is you have nectar producing plants throughout the year. And a lot of times your native, I say native, other places have a dearth or a lack of nectar producing plants, which can be detrimental to your beehives. So yes, the answer is yes. It's a great way to provide natural forage, not only for your bees to produce honey, but you're also benefiting native pollinators and monarchs in particular.
Awesome, thank you, Jonathan. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I agree with definitely with Jonathan. I've had quite a few landowners that have had bees, and they really like the Acres for Wildlife mix we plant on their property because they have flowering plants throughout the summer, which is really great for their bees. And so they've been really happy with their seed mix as long as they flower, from early spring to late summer, early fall.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. So we've been getting a couple different, basically questions that are getting around to cost share programs. So can you all kind of touch on that? Are there any programs that are available to help pay for planting a pollinator plot, or even thinning and burning our woods to promote native vegetation, or any program that can help pay for Sericea control?
Ryan, you want me to handle this, since you and everybody else has been talking?
Sure, go ahead, Bubba.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. There are programs. I think I see the first question is about Sericea control. I'm not aware of anything that would just, just aim at Sericea control. most of the time when we're trying to control something like Sericea, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, we're going to control it with the end goal being we're probably going to plant it back to a mix. So we do have programs like EQIP, CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. Arkansas Game and Fish has an Acres for Wildlife program that will either pay a cost share per practice to kind of reimburse the landowner, or our program, the Game and Fish one, we will actually provide the chemical and the seeds for you to replant back behind that. So that's 3 of them that I can think of. There's CRP out there too in the crop ground. If you've got like ag fields that you're wanting to convert from an ag to I guess a pasture type setting with forbs and grasses, that we could possibly look at some of the CRP practices to do that too. That actually pays you a rental rate and cost share on the chemicals. So anyway, that's the big ways that we do it here, a real 1,000-foot view. But like I say, usually when we're eradicating something or to try to get rid of one of the problem species, the end game is going to be to plant the mix. Also, to the next question, when we do plant these mixes, usually one of the biologists like myself or Ryan, Austin Clyce, Kelly, Michelle Furr, that's on these panels, that's in this on this call today, we usually work within RCS, and we have seed mixes that are kind of tailored to different areas of the state. And we have those that we can provide to people like in RCS or even landowners as well, so that, you know, as you take it to, you know, whatever seed company, say, hey, I need this, and I hope they take it and kind of bid it out so they can get the cheapest one available. But either you're one of the private land biologists or QF biologists out there, we've got mixes that are, like I say, kind of suitable to each section of the state, and we can help get that to the applicable person.
I think that was a perfect answer, Bubba.
Thank you.
In general, I would say not for everything, but for most things that you could want to do to improve your property, there's probably an avenue or a program out there to help you do that. And that's what our farm biologists and the private lands biologists, game and fish, really specialize in. So just get with those folks and you'll be well on your way to finding those opportunities.
Yeah.
Awesome. So our next couple of questions, I'm going to try and kind of combine, some are saying that they have like wooded property that they want to manage for monarchs. How would they do that? Or is there anything that I can do for pollinator habitat in my woods? A lot of my property is covered in trees, essentially.
Here you, Ryan.
I'll go ahead. So we heard a little bit earlier today, for those of you that might have been on, about, you know, the 1 to 1.5 million acres of prairie that the state used to have. And when Jennifer said that, she mentioned, you know, amongst all of the savanna and open woodland habitat that we had in the state too. So I say that to bring up the idea that most of the woods that occur in the state today do not really look anything like the woods looked like in the state pre-settlement. The Ozarks and Ouachitas would have largely been savanna and open woodland settings in most places, except for our more forested stands, like on a north or east slope, or down right next to a stream, perhaps on a more bottomland setting, and that applies to East Arkansas or you know, down in South Arkansas as well. So even South Arkansas was a lot more savanna and open woodland than it was now. So most of our wooded acres in the state are actually very manageable for good quality open habitat with lots of grasses and native forbs in the herbaceous layer. Most of the time, it really just takes some strategic tree thinning and that whether you do that commercially with a thinning or a harvest, or if you're going to do it, strictly for, habitat reasons and do, a timber stand improvement thinning, or, actually have like a hack and squirt crew come out and remove some of those trees, or a chainsaw crew remove some of those trees and just drop them and burn them. But strategically thinning your wooded acres, if they were historically more of a woodland and savanna setting, and then reintroducing prescribed fire to those areas is also very important. So getting sunlight to the ground, still leaving those large, mature, open-grown trees that were there, and getting fire in there to really help get that herbaceous layer restarted. A lot of these sites have pretty good plant response, especially if we're talking about more upland hardwood areas, but even some of our low pine areas and stuff like that can still have a really good plant response and be much more beneficial for monarchs and pollinators than they are at the moment. So there's absolutely a lot that we can do with those wooded acres. All of our wooded acres aren't created equal. So depending on the slope and aspect and soil type that you're sitting on, it might be slightly different from one stand to the next, but most of them do have things that can be done to make them more beneficial for wildlife in general, but especially monarchs and pollinators.
Michelle and Jonathan, do you have anything to add?
No, Ryan did a pretty daggone good job answering that. I mean, if you look at and read historical accounts, I mean, there's historical mentions of riding a horse and buggy through the woods here in central Arkansas and not hitting getting your hat knocked off by branches. I mean, so the woods were very open with a very rich understory, which we don't have a lot of that now. I mean, there's patches of it, but for the most part, messification's taken over, and we have a really shade tolerant forest. And so there is a lot of opportunity to change that around, and we're working on that. I mean, we'll hit on it tomorrow. We're working on BMP documents that kind of outline ways to get things back to that condition to get pollinator plants back in that understory.
Yep, I agree with Jonathan and Ryan. Sunlight to the ground plus burning, you can get pollinator back.
Awesome, thank you all. So I'll circle back to the biologist contact information because we'll just do that at the end. The next question is, can I fit pollinator habitat into my cattle operation somehow, or does it need to have cattle completely excluded?
Ryan, you're probably the best one to answer this.
Okay. Yeah. I firmly believe that we can manage both at the same time and be quite successful doing it. So, not every cow pasture is going to be the most pollinator friendly area, but we certainly can manage pastures in a way that they can be, especially if folks are willing to look into and talk about and perhaps move towards doing some native grazing. Our native grasses are much more friendly to the inclusion of these native forbs that are important for our native pollinators and for monarchs. And most of them are very palatable, both the native grasses and most of our native forbs. We have some native forb species or native broadleaves that aren't palatable to cattle, which are those species that most folks know very, very well and consider them weeds and those, problem species in pastures because cows don't eat them. There's a lot of other native forbs that do occur in some of our pastures at the moment. We just don't see them very often because they're getting grazed off like everything else. But we can include native forbs with native grasses in pastures and be very successful with this. And one of the other more important things with that too, and in order for that to work well, prescribed grazing, particularly some form of rotational grazing, would be important. So providing that rest for each pasture in succession as you move through there and allowing those plants to recover and for broadleaves to actually bloom and produce flowers and seed is going to be important for those plants and for forage. maintaining itself in those pastures, as well as obviously is important for our monarchs and other pollinators that use those sites as well. So yes, I think we can manage them well together. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do so. And it's the same thing for our non-native pastures. There are some non-native grazable legumes and things like that that we can include in those pastures to make them more friendly than they currently are. But, you know, as we talked about earlier, you know, we can use some non-natives and make things better for pollinators, but if we can use native stuff, it's going to be even better yet. So yes, we can move everything forward, and those small steps forward in making things incrementally better is a great place to start, and it's very important.
I'm going to piggyback on that. Oh, you put it on mute, so I figured he's done. I think that education is a big part of this. You know, a lot of people have this idea that you can't have both, and you can, especially in Arkansas. You know, pasture land is a large land base in Arkansas, and although we might not have the species diversity that we're looking for in these pastures, I think it's very important to benefit pollinators that we take what we can get. And a lot of these farmers, I mean, they're stewards of the land in general, most of them. Yeah, you have your bad ones, just like everywhere. But in general, they want to do good, and I think it's just educating them that they can. I mean, it might be a little bit of extra work for them here and there, but for the most part, I think that they would like to do that.
And I'll go ahead and jump on top of another potential question that might rise out of that. You know, we do hear concerns from folks about milkweeds in their pastures and how milkweed is toxic to their cattle. So milkweeds do all contain, I'm going to mispronounce this word, Leslie, but cardioglycides or
Cardiac glycosides.
There you go.
Cardiac.
So that is a toxic substance. But each species of milkweed contains a different amount of that toxic substance. Most of them contain enough to make them taste bitter and not necessarily harm larger organisms at all. But it's enough to keep, you know, other insects off of them that can't tolerate that chemical. There's really only a couple of milkweed species in the country that are toxic enough to be of concern to livestock owners. Both of them occur in the desert Southwest and do not grow here in Arkansas or really anywhere near here. So they're not a concern. There's some really interesting studies out of the Great Plains, out of Nebraska and Kansas and North Missouri, showing that there's even some selective grazing for milkweeds, especially common milkweed by cattle in some studies. So, you know, so a lot of our species we have here aren't even bitter enough to keep them from being grazed, and some of them are selectively grazed. But you're not going to have issues in Arkansas with cattle succumbing to those toxins from potentially eating a milkweed in your pasture.
Yeah, Ryan, I'll add to that too. I know it's been several years ago, but one time we were getting ready to plant, and there was a place where we were cutting it for hay, or I may have been grazing it, but we saw on a label that actually said that partridge peat could be, I guess, toxic to cattle too. But what it was, once you read about it, they would have to eat, I mean, so many pounds of it per day. So by the time you put it in a mix and you got it at so many seeds per square foot, man, they would never, I mean, it ain't even a possibility for them to eat that, eat that much of it. So we have to be careful when we hear things like that about, well, it could be toxic to cattle. Yeah, I mean, anything's possible, but the reality of it is it probably isn't.
Sure, and there's quite a few native plants that are quote unquote toxic, and again, most of the time that means it's bitter, and they're not going to eat it. And the more toxic ones, if they are eating it, I've always seen that be a case of really a case of overgrazing. So it's the only thing left that's bitter. They don't want to eat it, but if forced to, they will. There's quite a few non-native plants that occur in the state that are just as, if not more toxic to livestock, that are very widely spread across the landscape that we don't hear or worry near as much about. Beefsteak plant, shiso mint or whatever you want to call that, but beefsteak plant's one of them. It's quite toxic to cattle and horses, and I see it all over the place. Again, it's not grazed because it's bitter and they don't like it, but it also takes up a lot of grazing space too. So.
Okay, our next question, it kind of gets at, native seeds in the seed bank. When should you replant as opposed to managing the existing vegetation and promoting those natives in the seed bank? And how do you know if you have those desirable species in your seed bank?
You want me to take a stab?
Let's go in order for this one. Jonathan, you go first.
What was the question? I'm sorry. I have 3 kids running around.
You're good. It's not like you're busy. I'm just kidding. So
No,
how do I know if I have... Okay, yeah, it's the last question in the chat box. It's
Okay.
basically just asking about native seeds in the seed bank.
Okay, in short, I would say get a biologist out there to look around. You're going to have indicator species, and typically, I'm just talking typically, that are going to be there, and hopefully a biologist can look at it and recognize the potential of the site and not just go ahead and wipe everything out, but maybe look at selected spraying or selective herbicide use just to try to release what's in that seed bank based off what indicator species you see there. That'd be my short answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to see what's there for sure. And if you can't tell what's there, I definitely get a biologist to see if, you're starting from scratch, or if you're just going to have to do a little maintenance to release more native species that could be potentially there. Sometimes all you have to do is spray a few times, and you get a good response. You get quite a few native species pop up, or just a single burn will help. It's all dependent on what the site looks like and what's already out there.
Yeah, that's right. And I think kind of what Jonathan said. So, when to take it a step further, say you already have called a biologist and Bubba shows up, things we're looking for is like on the edges of, if it's a pasture, on the edges of the pasture where it hasn't been mowed or sprayed quite as heavily. That's where you'll see your indicator species. Another thing you can do is especially if the landowner has owned it for, like a generation, is ask them what has been the historical use of it. So if it was a crop field at one time that had been sprayed out since the early 80s and 90s, year in, year out, it's probably going to kind of used up that seed bank pretty well. Where if you're talking more of a kind of a forested setting or something like that, where it hasn't, or even a pasture a little bit, but if it hasn't been sprayed out over time with herbicides from crop use, it probably does. But if it has been sprayed, then you're probably looking at doing more of the replanting from that standpoint. So looking at historical use as well.
Yep, I agree completely with Bubba there. I was going to say, hopefully there's some indicator species on site to kind of let us know what's going on with what's on the ground. But really this question and trying to figure out if you have anything in your seed bank, even before you do anything, let's say it's currently in an old field situation, you've just been mowing, or a pasture that you're grazing, or a hay field. Before you do anything different than what your management has been, I think it's an opportunity to really dig into the history of that site, and that's very important. So a few examples of how that can work either in your favor or against you, and what that history is and what that might mean. So I've looked at a site in Faulkner County that was very obviously a crop field in the past. It actually even had terraces in it. So we knew that was cropped. I had assumed it was more recent because it had terraces. But the landowner, having been from that area and known the history of that farm very, very well, so that was a crop field in the 30s and 40s, and it was a cotton field. And then after that, it was let go, and it had grown back up into mostly a cedar patch with some other scrub oaks and stuff in there too. We would have guessed, being a crop field, that would have been very detrimental to the seed bank. And as Bubba mentioned, if it was a crop field here in the 80s and 90s, it would have been, because that would have been a crop field that would have been treated heavily with herbicides and chemicals, and we would have had a larger impact on that seed bank from those things coming up. But since that was a crop field site in the 30s and 40s and let go after that, that was long before we had widespread use or any use of ag chemicals at all. So that site would have been completely mechanical management on those crop field acres. So you still would have had a lot of native things coming up and things in that seed bank. And, then it got let go. It recovered over time, grew up into cedars because it was totally let go. But once those cedars were cut down and they burned that site, it came back and it looked as close to native prairie as I've ever seen an old field situation look. But again, that was something that was cropped and probably very heavily disturbed mechanically for 2 decades, but then let go. But it came back and looked very, very good. It certainly was missing some species, some of our more conservative things that we would have wanted. Still a site that has potential for interseeding, maybe not a full seed mix or a complete start over, but that's still something that had a very good rebound. And you could have seen that from those indicator plants that were coming in small spots of sunlight that was coming down through the cedars. Same holds true for like South Arkansas, where we have a lot of pine plantation. Again, it goes back to what the history of that site was before. So if that area was planted to pines early on, like in the 60s or 70s, and it was crop field before then, or maybe it was just forest before then, the likelihood of you having a good seed bank in that soil is pretty good, because that again would have been prior to widespread use of chemicals. If we were getting into the 80s or 90s and it was crop field and then planted the pines at that point, or if it's been harvested and sometime in the past 10 to 20 years it was harvested and replanted with chemical use for site prep, then we're talking about a situation where we may not have as good of a response from the seed bank. You'll still have some native stuff there. As much as we might try as humans, we can never ever completely get rid of native annual weedy species and things like that. Annuals are going to be pretty typical response anywhere. You're never going to get rid of that stuff. And they're native. They might not be the highest quality native stuff, but they are native species, and they'll rebound for us. But so the older the site on a pine planting, the more likely it might be to have a good seedbed response. The younger it is, if it was crop field in the 80s prior to being planted, might not have as good of a response, and we might see more of our weedy type things instead of some higher quality grasses and forbs coming in.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan, I was going to finish too. Maybe you remember on a little bio on our area, we went in and thinned it back in 2017, I think 16, 17, and in attempts for quail management, and that it was planted. Game and Fish bought that in '91. It was been cotton fields. I mean, for however long before that. I mean, 20, 30, 40 years before that, at least. And anyway, so it got planted to oak trees, CRP type oak trees in '91. We came in 2016 and cut it back open, and the butterfly milkweed exploded out there. And it's just been there. That's crop field, and it probably under the harshest conditions of crop field. So it can persist. It can persist for a long time. One of the reasons that we as biologists, I think too, sometimes jump to the side of planting. If we go sign up for an EQIP contract or a CSP contract, which is what most of our landowners are working with, we're under a timeline. So if we sprayed it out and said, well, we're just going to spray this, and we wait another full growing season to come back in, and then it's not, and we have to spray it again, we're looking at 2 or 3 years down the line before we do plant it. And that's a long time to keep some landowners on the hook. We got to get things done, like I say, under some timelines, for program reasons too. So I would say that, if you're not sure and you're just a landowner, or if there's somebody here that just has a little bit of an area that's Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, spray it out and see what comes up. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything to get rid of Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or whatever it is. Spray it out. Let's try to clean it up, see what comes back. And then, if it doesn't, then worry about that at that point. But I don't think you can get any, I hate to say you can't get any worse, but you're not really going to hurt anything by trying to, clean it up with herbicide for a growing season.
Yeah, especially for sites that are solid.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing else out there anyway, but Bermuda or Bahia or, some other invasive shrub or anything like that, you're not going to hurt. If there's no native things growing there to hurt, a chemical application at that time, especially contact herbicide, is not going to hurt anything in the seed bank either. So it's just getting rid of what's currently there. I'll also add that, I would like to say that there's a big difference in the quality of habitat for wildlife in general, but pollinators and monarchs on a site that, if we know the site has a cropping history and we know, there's always a seed bank there, but we know what plants to expect from an old field situation that was cropped in the past. We're going to have a lot of those weaker perennials and annual species that come up. There's going to be blooming species in there, absolutely. There's going to be plenty of native broadleaves that come up from a seed bank in an old field type situation. But the quality of habitat for that type of situation versus something that's, a high diverse planting instead, even getting up towards almost, a prairie restoration type planting, the quality of those two habitats can be drastically different. So an old field situation, a lot of times those are species that they're weedy species. They'll come up anywhere if we just stop doing management to it and let it go. A lot of times those are things that, are important for sure. I'm not one to downplay them at all, but we're going to be providing habitat for other generalist pollinators. And in general, in my thinking, generalist species of pollinators aren't the ones that are in dire need and that we're seeing huge declines on. All species are probably seeing some declines, but the species that are really in dire need of help and good habitat need very specific plants in that habitat. And a lot of times those are types of plants are conservative species that will not come back from a disturbed seed bank type situation or an old field type situation. That's why we look at a lot of times seeing it worthwhile and worth the investment to do a high diversity replanting versus just going for that, an early successional old field type situation. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's absolutely what a landowner wants, or if it's just out of the question to be able to do a seeding, even with cost share, it can be expensive up front sometimes, but we can do that, and it's better than keeping it in Bermuda or some other non-native invasive thing. Absolutely. But there can be a drastic difference in the value of that habitat versus the value of a high diversity replanting or prairie reconstruction.
Okay. There's a couple of questions that I really want to get through in the next 12 minutes. Let's see. So the first one, I'm going to combine about 3 questions. The last question we got in the chat box was asking why seed rates are so light in native pollinator mixes. Another question was, why are so many species in those regional seed mixes that we talked about earlier? 60 species seems like a lot and it sounds expensive. And then another person asked of how many species should I plant in a mix? So take that how you will. Dissect it amongst yourselves.
I'll answer that last one first. As many as you can get your hands on.
Yep.
Yeah, so, and we've heard it all day. So diversity is key, right? And providing a diverse array of plants in your field is going to help ensure that we have blooming plants all year long, or all throughout the growing season at least. And the likelihood of us being able to provide a specific plant that's needed for a specialist species of insect is much greater if we have a high diversity planting. That coincides with the number of species in the mix, and it looks expensive because it has a lot. So generally speaking, if we can include a large number of species in the seed mix, that gives us more leeway to play with the rates on each individual species. So if we really want a species in a seed mix, but that species by itself per pound is very expensive, a lot of times those species that are super expensive are also very, very small seeded species. So it doesn't take a whole lot of that species seed in a mix to make it a good component of that field after it's planted. So don't let individual species costs freak you out about what it might cost to include in your mix, because a lot of times, you know, a species like cardinal flower that can cost upwards of $1,000 an acre, you only need 1,000th of a pound in it in a seed mix to have almost a seed per square foot, because there's over 1 million seeds per pound in that stuff. So you can include cardinal flower at extremely low rates and still have a lot of it in your field, and then it only costs you $1 an acre to have it in there. So the more species we have in a seed mix, the more we can play with the rates on those species. And actually, we can a lot of times get that seed mix to a very reasonable level, if not even cheaper than a low diversity seed mix. I've seen very many seed mixes that are 40 to 60 species cost less than a typical like 12 species seed mix, because in order to get the same rate overall of the mix, as you know, we're shooting for like 30 seeds per square foot on seed mixes. If you only have 12 species to pick from, there's not nearly as much leeway to play with the price as if you have 60. You can adjust things more and get the price down there. So just because it has a lot of species in the mix doesn't mean that it's more expensive.
That was a good answer, Ryan.
Does anyone else?
Sounded good to me.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, that was a
Michelle?
very good.
I
Very
don't
good
have
explanation.
else.
I'm not
Right.
dumbing that down, none. No, you just let that ride.
Mine's got that all in the bag.
Was there something else? Was it why are seed rates so light?
Well,
Um,
Yeah,
touch on that.
So just briefly, seed rates today might seem lighter than they were that we used 5 to 10 years ago. So we've become better at making native seed mixes. And now that seed mixes are more diverse and every one of these species has seeds that are different sizes, we can't just make seed mixes that are 5 pounds per acre anymore, because that doesn't mean anything from one species to the next.
Right.
So we're making seed mixes now at a seeds per square foot level, so we can actually calculate based on the size of an individual species seed how much should be in there to get a seed per square foot. And that's just a general number. A lot of them aren't in there at that high of a rate. But the overall rate, we're still shooting for wildlife seed mixes to be about 30 seeds per square foot. And compared to historic mixes, you know, full seeding rate on most things is considered 40 seeds per square foot. So for wildlife purposes, we bump that down a little bit to 30 just to make sure we're not getting a super thick planting right off the bat. That'll help us maintain it in a more wildlife friendly fashion with a little bit of bare ground and not be solid grass for longer term in the future. So really it's just a matter of how we've looked at our seed mixes in the past and progressing forward with our knowledge and what we need and how much seed we really need to put out there to be successful. So there's a point where, you know, we don't need to spend $1,000 per acre in seed to have a heavy seed rate to be successful, when we can put a lighter seed rate but still successful on the ground and only cost $200, $250 an acre.
Awesome. Thank you all. So in prairie restoration projects, do you ever add carbon materials like straw or wood chips to raise the fungal levels in the soil? Or do you rely on biomass from your plantings to slowly build that over time?
I'll go ahead and just say no. No, we don't. The only thing we ever really add to our seed mix is just something to help carry some seeds, like Ron was talking about, something like rice bran or some sort of other material like that, just to help carry seeds, but not as far as trying to raise fungal levels. No.
So I agree. I've never put anything like that to raise fungal levels. So there are a couple of things that I have done specifically to try to raise mycorrhizal fungi levels in the soil prior to planting, either prior to planting or during planting. I have had a couple projects where folks had native soils on site, and they did actually put that in a broadcast, and they broadcast some native soil from a site that was going to be disturbed anyway onto a new site to try to inoculate it. And that, according to research, does work and can work well. But again, I'd hate to tear up a native site to use soil like that unless it was already going to get destroyed by other means. And that can work, and research shows that does work. You can actually buy soil inoculants for native mycorrhizal fungi. I think Eric mentioned that earlier. I don't know how expensive that is, but that's something that can just be spread onto a site as well. I have not done that, but I do know it's available, and I know that there's probably going to be more of that type of product available in the future, and I hope that might prove to be very successful and helpful in some of these restorations. The other thing I've done is, if we were going from a crop field situation to do a prairie restoration, or even just, a very generic, even, low diversity native mix, even just for native grasses. As I mentioned earlier, so crop field situations are very heavy in soil bacteria and very light generally on mycorrhizal fungi. There are some crop species that have been shown to be beneficial to soil mycorrhizal fungi development. One of those being like forage sorghum. So you can plant, if you no-till plant forage sorghum into a field, let it grow, and either burn that off or hay that off. That forage sorghum, when you plant that into a crop field, they've shown that it does, over that year, increase mycorrhizal fungi activity in that soil. Now, whether or not it's the same species of mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with native grasses or not is still not completely known, I don't think. But I have seen sites do that, and just anecdotally, on a whole lot of field CRP conversions, if we had folks do a cover crop year of forage sorghum prior to doing their CRP planting, those sites always had excellent establishment in the first year. And then the next door neighbor right across the street that just went from crop field and tried to plant their CRP seed saw a much, much slower development of that field. So I do think there is something there. That's just based on my own observations and some light reading. But I think we're getting more and more research going down that path too. And again, I'm hoping that it can really help us out and save us some effort and some time on establishing these things.
Okay, we're getting tight on time, but I had one more question that I wanted to throw out there because the term was mentioned. Why are non-native invasive plants so bad? They seem to have a lot of flowers that would be good for pollinators too.
So even if non-native invasive species produce blooms. Again, they're not going to be blooms that are used by our own specialist pollinator species. Those are going to be blooms that are going to be utilized by our other generalist species that occur here in the United States, which is not a terrible thing, but they're also only going to be blooming for the time that they're blooming, and by their own definition of being invasive, they're outcompeting and replacing potentially extremely positive native vegetation on that site that would be much, much more beneficial. So they're just a negative impact overall, even for any slight benefit they may have for some species for some part of the year. The overall is drastically negative.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. They may be temporarily beneficial, but when you're, and Ryan's talked about it several times, when you're looking at host-specific plants that we're looking for, some of these lower tolerant species, they don't do well with competition. And so when we can eliminate that competition or avoid it, that would be ideal.
Yep, diversity is key, and they eliminate diversity for sure.
So
Oh,
Leslie,
excellent point.
I saw the last question
Go
here.
ahead.
From TazSync. So what if we're dealing with heavily degraded or barren soils? Do we not need to feed the soil carbon prior to sowing seed for the planting, or will some pioneer species be able to rebuild or repair the soil themselves? I think that's going to be heavily site dependent. We have a lot of native species that do well on what we might consider degraded or barren soils. If you're in the, and I don't know the specific situation we're talking about, but if we're talking about like a crop field that's just been heavily eroded and now it's, barren, doesn't grow stuff very well, there are species that do grow well in that site, and it might be a lot easier to just pick those species and plant a mix containing those to help move us down that path. But I haven't ever done any mixing of straw or wood chips to be able to accomplish that. I have done some reading on using biochar to do that type of thing, but you would have to have a lot of that material to do so. Honestly, you might be just as well off to let it grow back in whatever early successional plant materials try to come in there, try to stop doing soil disturbances and start letting those things grow that will grow there, and using prescribed fire to burn them off, and letting that carbon and the carbon from the root materials of those plants that are growing there to help build that back. And that'll probably happen faster and be better for the soil overall, as opposed to trying to mix in more outside materials on that site. And again, this is all assuming we're talking about, a crop field type site. But, if you're up in the hills and it looks like a barren or degraded area, that might very well be, a natural glade that's supposed to be that way. But again, that's hard to tell from just a question on here. But it's a good question to have somebody, get a hold of your local biologist, have them come out and look at it, and kind of go from there.
So unless anyone else has anything to add, that is a great segue into my closing question. Does anyone have any last notes on that? Okay. So one question that I got asked last week was an individual. He had just recently purchased a new piece of property, and I let him know that he could reach out to his local biologist to receive, some technical assistance so that he could establish pollinator habitat. And he said that, he might have to wait on that because he couldn't afford a biologist at this time. Could all of you kind of comment on that? And also, we've talked about the private lands biologist, the farm bill biologist, the foresters a lot. Can you talk about how to find your local biologist, please?
Me first?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Well, first, as far as finding us go, we should have maps in private land biologist section on, I believe we've got a page on the AGFC website. As far as affording us. We're all free. We do this free of charge. I'll let Ryan speak for his people, but they do too. We're actually glad to do it. It's what we're hired to do, is to help private landowners. And it's really down from smaller acreages, from a quarter acre or whatever it may be, all the way up to hundreds of acres. So it gets a little trickier once it gets smaller, but we have dealt with some before, and that's when we call Ryan or we'll call somebody else in. But there's no charge. That's what we're here to do, is help you with no matter what you have. And like I said, we should have in our guidebooks, for hunting, fishing, those I know our maps are in there, and then like I said, also on our webpage on AGFC, we have all of our contact information there.
We're the same way, Leslie. I mean, we're public stewards. I mean, we're paid by tax dollars, and it's free of charge. We're here to serve the people.
Yep. Like Bubba said, all the farm biologist positions with Quail Forever in the state are partnership positions between Quail Forever, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we are also absolutely free of charge. We exist here on the landscape to go out and help landowners with habitat on their working lands and on their farm landscapes. And we're very excited to be able to do so. In that regard, the foresters, your county foresters, exist in the same capacity. They're free of charge. Every county has a forester you can get hold of, talk, in conjunction with your biologist if you're wanting to do some habitat work on your forest lands. And then your NRCS office is always a very good opportunity to find those professionals to be able to get you the help you need. And they'll be able to help you on a lot of your scenarios, and they can get you in contact with the correct biologist or forester for your area. But for our Quail Forever bios, you can find their information. If you go to quailforever.org and look at the Find a Biologist page, you can type in your zip code or your city, and it'll show you your nearest biologist with their contact info as well.
I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists. There were a lot of great questions and a lot of really great answers, a lot of great information. I see a lot of people sending their appreciation in the chat box. If you have any questions or you have trouble finding those sites, I'm going to put my email up one last time. Feel free to reach out and I can connect you with your local biologist. Thank you all for joining us for the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum, and thank you again to our panelists. I really appreciate the time that you took to lend your knowledge and share it with us. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.